Welcome back, demigods, monsters, and gods alike, to the Olympus Report. To wrap up our Pride Month celebrations, we're going to be recapping Nico's very own book. Here's everything you need to know about The Sun and the Star, a Nico Di Angelo adventure. The Sun and the Star is the most recent entry in the Riordanverse, meaning it takes place after Heroes of Olympus and after the Trials of Apollo. So if you haven't read those series first, I recommend that. But if you have, let's jump right into it. The Sun and the Star starts differently than any other book in the Riordanverse. It starts in the future. Will and Nico are talking to some woman named Gorgyra, and she's asking them to tell her a story. Nico looks at Will, who is bleeding and looks very pale and very tired. Will tries to grab Nico's hand. Nico asks what kind of story, and Gorgyra says to tell me about the two of you. We then jump to present-day Camp Half-Blood, where Will and Nico are walking with Will's half-siblings Austin and Kayla. And naturally, the three Apollo siblings are teasing the son of Hades, making him choose someone from Star Wars to go on a date with. Nico does not know much about the fandom, but he did watch the movies because Will loves them so much. Eventually, Nico chooses Darth Vader, and the three laugh at him. Nico doesn't care, he's just happy he can make Will laugh. Sometimes he has a hard time believing that Will is actually his boyfriend. As they continue walking through camp, Nico notices how empty it is. It's the last day of summer and most campers have returned home for the year. And Nico has to admit he's going to miss the busy days at Camp Half-Blood. But then Nico remembers the prophecy, a prophecy he heard from Rachel Elizabeth Dare talking about Nico and the voice he's been hearing in his dreams begging for help. The four reach the edge of camp and Nico summons the Grey Sisters taxi to take Austin and Kayla to the city. Kayla is not fond of the idea, but Nico says it will be fine. No one's died yet. Nico and Will have decided to stay at camp year-round. Nico, since he doesn't really have any other place to go, and Will has decided to keep Nico company, as his mom will be touring anyway. Austin and Kayla leave in the taxi, and Will and Nico walk back to camp, joking that for once they have nothing to do. No evil Roman emperors to stop or dads to help back to Olympus. Nico laughs, but then remembers the voice calling to him, the voice from Tartarus, and thinks this peace won't last for long. Nico remembers the first time he told Will about the voice, and as much as Will tries to help, sometimes he just can't understand the underworld part of Nico. Nico had sensed Jason's death, and it sent him into a tailspin of grief and anger. Jason was the first person to see Nico as himself. Then the voice got more insistent. But Will insisted that maybe it was just PTSD. Nico said his whole life is a disorder. Nico meant this to be funny, but Will didn't laugh. Will suggested that maybe Nico talk to Mr. D. Nico decided that Will was right, so he sought the help of Mr. D, who was actually very concerned about the son of Hades, and vowed to help Nico get to the bottom of these nightmares. So every morning during the summer, Nico had confided his nightmares to Mr. D. Once Nico had returned to his cabin, he stays awake for a long time thinking about his conversations that he's had with Mr. D. He doesn't want to go to sleep as he doesn't want to deal with the nightmares and the voice begging for help. Nico is almost certain that the voice is calling from Tartarus, and he's pretty sure it belongs to Bob the Titan, formerly known as Iapetus, who took a dip in the River Lethe, the River of Forgetfulness, and was renamed Bob by Percy Jackson. Nico had become close with Bob while visiting him several times in Hades' palace. Nico had gotten him the job there as a janitor. Bob helped Percy and Annabeth escape Tartarus, but stayed behind, sacrificing himself so the two demigods could make it out safely. At this, Nico can't help but feel guilty. There has to be more that he can do. Maybe Mr. D and everyone was right. Maybe the voice was PTSD, but that didn't explain the prophecy. It was with this thought that Nico finally lets sleep consume him. Nico dreams he's in a dark void and hears a voice calling out to him, but it's not Bob. It's the voice of his mother. Nico tries desperately to reach her, but he can't, and then Nico falls into a pit and lands on a soft bed. Nico recognizes the room almost instantly. It's the room from when he and Bianca stayed at the Lotus Hotel and Casino. And when he looks next to him on the bed, it's his sister Bianca asleep. Nico tries desperately to wake her and warn her, but for some reason, Nico can't talk. When he runs into the bathroom and looks in the mirror, he has no mouth. He panics and runs back into the room, but Bianca is gone. And then Nico once again falls through the floor into darkness. Nico lands on a bridge, but the cars are frozen. When Nico looks inside the window, he sees the driver is asleep. It's the day Kronos attacked Manhattan. Nico then sees the Titan King, and Kronos tells Nico to listen. Nico says, "I'm trying. Who's ever trying to reach me, I'm trying." Kronos then swings his scythe at Nico, but before it can connect, Nico is once again swallowed by the darkness. Nico wakes up in the jar that Otis and Ephialtes once captured him in. Nico asks the voice why he must relive all this. He's trying to listen. If his subconscious was trying to tell him something, this was a terrible way to do it. Then the jar tips over, and when Nico looks up, he sees Percy Jackson, the boy he once thought he loved. The love that tore Nico up for a long time. But getting over Percy was actually pretty easy, and now Nico considered Percy a good friend. Nico reaches out to take Percy's hand, but Percy's getting farther and farther away. In fact, Nico is shrinking. Percy tells Nico that he made a mistake and Nico needs to fix it. Nico has to go. Nico asks where, but then once again, Nico falls. Nico crashes into a column and recognizes immediately where he is, a place he swore to never think about again. The day he and Jason confronted Cupid and retrieved Diocletian's scepter. Except Jason isn't here this time, and the emptiness at this that Nico feels in his chest is raw. Nico is then confronted by the god, telling Nico that he must fix it. Cupid tells Nico to look at him, and then he does. Except it's Will, then Cupid, then back to Will again, then back to Cupid. Will/Cupid tells Nico that he needs to tell him the truth. And then Nico laughs hysterically. And just when Nico thinks he's about to go completely insane, he wakes up in a panic and accidentally kicks Will in the stomach. Nico apologizes and said he had a really bad dream. Will can tell how shaken up Nico is and asks if he can hold him. Nico doesn't like to be vulnerable, but decides to let his boyfriend comfort him this time. All too soon, however, they are interrupted by Chiron that tells them they have a visitor. Rachel Elizabeth Dare comes into the cabin and says that Nico has to listen. Nico is about to scream, he knows, when Rachel's eyes go green and green smoke starts coming from her mouth. She's sprouting a prophecy. Go forth and find the one who calls out your name, who suffers and despairs for refusing to remain. They leave something of equal value behind, or your body and soul no one will ever find. Afterwards, Rachel falls forward and Will catches her. Chiron tells Nico to take some time to figure out the prophecy, and Nico tells Chiron there's no need. This isn't the first time Nico and Will have heard this prophecy. They meant to tell Chiron, they just hadn't found the right time. Rachel then starts to regain consciousness and tells Chiron they're telling the truth. For some reason, this prophecy keeps repeating itself. Someone must really need Nico's attention. Rachel says this is the 12th time she said this prophecy. Mr. D then joins them in the cabin with some popcorn, apparently looking for a good show. Rachel disregards this and says Nico needs to start this quest right away or the prophecy will keep coming. Chiron asks if they have any idea what it's about, and Nico says he knows it's about Bob. Chiron is confused. Did Nico mean that the Titan was once again a threat? Nico says no, Bob is trapped in Tartarus, and his friend needs his help. Mr. D says it could be a trap, and he doesn't want Nico to get hurt. At this, Nico is touched and asks if he can have some of Mr. D's popcorn, and the wine god says absolutely not. Will then speaks up, saying that whether or not it's a trap, they're ignoring the big picture, Tartarus. And Will especially doesn't like the line about leaving something behind. Chiron says they should wait for more information before issuing a quest, but Nico says he'll go with or without one. Mr. D asks how, as Hades isn't letting anyone into the underworld anymore. Nico says there's always a way into the underworld. Besides, Nico's one of the few who have been to Tartarus and survived. He can do it again, and he'll do it alone. Will says that is absolutely not happening. If Nico is going, Will is going too. And Nico says no, he can't let him do that, but Will says he's just as capable as Nico, and he's going whether Nico likes it or not. Chiron brings up the fact that a child of Apollo, the sun god, may not fare too well in a place with no sunshine, and Will says he'll be fine. Nico finally relents. Besides, Percy and Annabeth only survived Tartarus because they had each other, so maybe he and Will can do the same. Chiron once again voices his concerns. What if the prophecy means Nico has to leave Will behind? At this, Nico feels sick. Will says that won't happen. He won't let it. Will is not going to sacrifice himself. Nico says it's settled then. It looks like they're going to Tartarus. At this, Mr. D says he's impressed and offers Nico some of his popcorn as a sign of respect. We then jump back to the future where Will and Nico are bargaining with Gorgyra. If they tell her a story, she will give them a boat. The story she would like to hear is the story about how the two came into each other's lives. Nico says if he tells her, will she promise to help, and Gorgyra agrees. So Nico begins to tell her the story of how he and Will met. Back in the present day, Will and Nico prepare for their quest, and Nico can't help but be a little annoyed at just how much Will is packing. But at the same time, Nico is actually kinda excited to show the underworld to Will, his second home, if you will. Nico tells Will that he won't need all that stuff, but Will insists that you never know. Will then says they need to go get medical supplies, and Nico relents, but only if they can leave after that. They do not leave after that. Afterwards, they get sidetracked by Juniper, who gives them some ambrosia squares. Then finally, Will and Nico catch a taxi, a regular human taxi per Will's request, to a train station, where they catch a train to the city. On the ride, Nico notices something in Will's backpack and asks what it is. Will seems embarrassed but brings out what looks like a ball. Will explains it's a battery-powered sun lamp for when Will is in darkness. It's not the same as the sun, but maybe it will help the child of Apollo in the underworld. Nico is seriously impressed and says that's a brilliant idea. Nico notices that Will seems very comfortable on the subway, and Will explains that he used to come to the city a lot with his mom when she was touring, and she insisted they take public transportation to get the authentic New York experience. In fact, it was in the city with his mom when Will was discovered by a satyr and brought to Camp Half-Blood. Nico asks Will if he ever wishes he had a normal life, and Will says no. He's able to heal people, and besides, if he had a normal life, he would have never met Nico. Nico says this is very cheesy, but he'll allow it. The two then share a kiss and enjoy the rest of the subway ride in silence. Will falls asleep, and Nico can't help but think about his dream last night, and Cupid/Will telling Nico that he had to tell him the truth. Was Nico a bad boyfriend by dragging Will to Tartarus? Before Nico has much time to think about it, they arrive at Penn Station. Nico wakes Will up and says they need to make a quick detour first. As they navigate Penn Station, Nico complains about all the people. Will says he's just grumpy that he wouldn't let Nico shadow travel. Nico says it would have been a lot faster, and Will says that shadow travel is not good for Nico's health and he should only do it in emergency situations, and this is not an emergency. Then a woman bumps into Will and spills her iced coffee all over him. Nico laughs and asks, "Is it an emergency yet?" Will says no, and eventually the two make it out of the station. Will then notices where they are, Percy's apartment. Will says that he thought Percy was in California, and Nico says he is. Nico doesn't want to recruit him. So the two head up to Percy's apartment and are greeted by Sally Jackson, who welcomes them with blue cookies. Nico just wants to talk to Percy. Hopefully talking to someone who has been to Tartarus will make Will seem less nervous. Sally says they can use Percy's humidifier and send an iris message. Soon Percy and Annabeth appear in the mist, and Percy is thrilled to see Nico and Will. Percy asks what's up, and Nico says he'd like Percy's advice for their upcoming quest. Nico then explains that they're going to Tartarus, and Percy and Annabeth think they've misheard them. Percy says he nearly lost his mind in that place. Will does not feel any better after hearing that. Nico explains that they're going back for Bob, and at this, Annabeth and Percy get quiet, looking guilty. Annabeth had forgotten about him. How could she do that? But why Nico? Why wouldn't Bob reach out to Percy? Nico doesn't know, but either way, nothing is going to stop him. Percy says Bob is a Titan, so if anyone could survive Tartarus this long, it's him. Percy says that as long as Nico and Will have each other, they'll make it out. Percy knows it. They can remind each other of what it is they're fighting for. That's what kept Percy and Annabeth sane down there. And at this, Will does feel a little bit better. Before Annabeth and Percy go, Annabeth says that if they can find Bob's cat, Small Bob, he might be able to help them, being a saber-toothed zombie cat. And that it would also mean a lot to Bob. They both need to come home. The call disconnects and Sally packs them some snacks for their journey. Then, holding hands, Will and Nico once again set off for the subway and end up at Central Park, the doors of Orpheus. But the only way to open them is with music, so Nico asks Will to sing. Nico can tell Will is nervous about what's ahead, and Nico says it'll be okay. They have each other, and their friends will help them once in the underworld. Will asks who, and Nico says the troglodytes. They've relocated to the underworld. For people who don't know, the troglodytes are frog lizard creatures who live underground and helped Apollo infiltrate the Tower of Nero. Will says it will be nice to see them again, but doesn't understand how they could live down there in a place of misery. At this, Nico gets a little upset. He wishes Will would be more open-minded when it came to the underworld. It's not all bad. Nico tries to tell Will that the underworld is more than just death. Will has a hard time believing this, but says he trusts Nico, and then sings and opens up the doors. Nico says he'll go first, and the two head into the underworld. However, Nico quickly notices that it is taking longer than usual. The steps seem to never end. And then Nico hears something. Water. The river Styx. They've made it. Nico looks out and sees the underworld. Nico enthusiastically tells Will to look, but Will asks if this is a joke. Nico is very confused. Will says there's nothing there, and when Nico turns back, the underworld is gone, and they're back in the dark stairway. Nico insists that they need to keep going, and eventually Nico and Will see a light at the end of the stairs. But when they get to it, instead of the underworld, they're back in Central Park. Nico doesn't understand. Will then falls to his knees in despair and asks what is going on. We once again then jump to the future, to Nico telling Gorgyra about the time he first met Will, during the battle against Gaia. At this, Will grunts and says they've known each other a lot longer, since the Battle of Manhattan, even though Nico wasn't staying at camp. Will says Nico was super annoying, not trusting anyone, and Nico says sometimes it's still hard for him to trust people. Will says that he was super sad when Nico left camp to go and find Percy after he disappeared. Nico asks why, they hardly knew each other. Will says no, they didn't, but for some reason Will was drawn to Nico. He wanted to be his friend. This shocks Nico, as not many people wanted to be his friend back then. Will says that's not true, Nico just didn't give anyone a chance. Will then says that they've actually known each other since before the Battle of Manhattan. When Nico first came to camp as a 10-year-old, he accidentally sliced his leg open, and it was actually Will who healed him and tried to calm him down, or at least Will tried. This makes Nico remember that day. Nico tells Will that he did calm him down. Nico hadn't even realized that that was Will. Nico doesn't remember much from his first weeks at camp. Nico says maybe they don't know the exact point they met, but Nico remembers when he considered Will a friend. It was after the Battle of Gaia. Will scolded Nico, but all Nico could focus on was that Will actually wanted Nico around. Will had said he could use a friendly face, and no one had ever called Nico a friendly face before. He felt accepted instead of rejected for the first time in his life. Even though at this point Nico had fulfilled his promise to Gorgyra, Nico feels like sharing more, and Will encourages him. Nico starts to tell the story of when he realized Will was more than a friend. Back in the present, Nico and Will are trying to figure out what the heck is going on. Nico notices that Will is struggling to stand. Nico goes to help him up. Will says he's fine, just very sleepy for some reason. Will asks Nico what's going on. Nico doesn't know. Maybe Hades is preventing them from entering the underworld. Nico asks if Will can open the entrance again, and Will is very sleepy but manages to sing a song and open the gates once again. Nico then looks into the opening, but when he looks back, Will is gone. Nico panics, but when he looks again, Will has reappeared. Something is definitely going on. Someone does not want them in the underworld. As they once again step into the entrance, Nico asks if Will could maybe glow a little bit so they could see a little bit better. Nico grabs Will's hand and says not to let go, and with that, they once again descend into the underworld. They almost make it to the Styx when both begin to get very tired. Nico says they just need to make it a bit more. But then Will's hand slips from Nico and he collapses, saying he doesn't belong here. Nico tries to comfort him, but when he looks up, they're back in Central Park, and Nico hears a voice begging for help. Nico screams and then passes out. Meanwhile, Will's perception of things are a little different. Will never passed out from his point of view. In fact, he and Nico are still standing on the banks of the river Styx. Nico then takes off, and Will runs after him. Will calls for him to stop, but he doesn't. Nico looks back at Will and then jumps into the river Styx. Will screams, but Nico looks unharmed. In fact, he's doggy paddling in the river. This doesn't make sense. According to Percy, the river Styx almost destroyed him. As Will watches Nico, he gets angry. This wasn't part of the plan, was it? Why was Nico always keeping secrets from him? Nico then calls out to Will to jump in. The water's great. Nico calls Will a coward, and this hurts Will. How could Nico think that? So Will jumps in, and it's pure agony. But Will forces himself to follow Nico, and just barely manages to follow Nico out of the water and onto the riverbed. Will looks around, but Nico is gone, and Nico's voice taunts Will, that Will is holding him back. Then Will passes out. Meanwhile, Nico, the real Nico, wakes up at the bottom of the stone steps. When he looks around, he sees Will lying unconscious next to him, and above him is a creature made out of shadows, and the creature is taunting Will in his sleep. Nico screams to leave him alone. The creature introduces himself as the demon Ephialtes, not to be confused with Ephialtes the giant. The creature put Nico and Will to sleep, and has been toying with them. The time loop on the stairs, Will chasing Nico into the river, none of that has been real. It's all been nightmares. Nico tries to keep the demon talking, hoping that if Nico distracts it, Will wake up on his own. Ephialtes says that his mother will be so proud of him for trapping demigods. Will then slowly starts to wake up, but it isn't for long. The shadow demon reaches out and traps Nico and Will. Once again, Nico slips into darkness. Nico finds himself at Camp Half-Blood in the big house, reliving a day he never wanted to think about again. The day Percy told Nico that Bianca would not be coming back. At this, Nico screams. He refuses to relive that day. Then Nico hears the voice of the demon taunting him, saying he has no choice. Nico asks the demon if he's the one that's been sending him nightmares all these months, and at this, Ephialtes is a little bit confused. No, his mother only required him to intercept Will and Nico once they entered the underworld. Nico asks who his mother is, and at this, the demon just laughs, and Nico falls into darkness. Next, we see Will's nightmare. He's dreaming about the day he helped Meg and Apollo enter the Tower of Nero. Nico is hurt badly, and Will can't heal him. Meg and Apollo taunt him. Apollo calls him a failure. Surely he can't be a son of his. They chant, heal him, heal him, heal him. But for some reason, Will can't. And then Will once again slips into the darkness. As Nico is falling into another nightmare, he can sense something. So Nico lashes out, and instead of another nightmare, Nico wakes up, and he has his hands around Ephialtes' throat. Nico says the demon shouldn't have underestimated him on his own turf. Nico summons a skeleton army, but just as quickly, Ephialtes puts them to sleep. Ephialtes is the demon of nightmares, and even the dead dream. Then Ephialtes starts to summon his own army, and it is a very familiar looking manticore, Dr. Thorne, Nico's old principal and headmaster. And just like that, Nico feels like a kid again, alone and helpless. Will then regains consciousness and realizes that everything that has happened has been a dream, and Nico needs his help. Will stands up and screams. A concentrated beam of light shoots out of Will and slashes the shadow demon's appendages. The demon is shocked. Will says if he's darkness, then Will is the light. The demon is shrinking away and says that his mother will be so disappointed in him. Will says that the demon has really good nightmares. Will totally believed them until 2 minutes ago. At this, Ephialtes is pleased. Will asks who his mother is, and the demon says Will will find out soon enough. And then Will blasts the demon again, and Ephialtes dissolves into light. Nico is super impressed by his boyfriend's new power and calls him a real-life demigod Care Bear. However, this power drained a lot of energy out of Will, so Nico sits and lets Will rest his head on his lap for a little bit. Nico then thinks about the last time he saw his father. Hades had told Nico that he hoped that Nico could be the first of his children to actually be happy. Was Nico happy? Well, he was a lot happier than he's ever been with Will, but he still wished that Will would be more accepting of the darker part of himself. After eating some ambrosia, Will is getting a little bit better, so the two continue throughout the underworld. In order to stay out of Hades' sight, they need to travel down a narrow path that overlooks Asphodel. Will mentions that there's so many dead people, and doesn't this bother Nico? Nico says no, it's a part of life, and most of these people just wandered through life anyway, so Asphodel isn't really all that different. Will then swears that he heard something, and Nico says it's probably nothing, they're just still on edge. Will worries that maybe they're still in a nightmare, so Nico kisses Will and asks if this feels like a nightmare, and Will says it definitely does not. Nico says correct answer, and then they continue forward. Finally, they reach the home of the troglodytes. Troglodytes are very fond of clothes and especially hats. Nico and Will are greeted by the CEO of the troglodytes, Screechbling, dressed up as George Washington. The troglodytes, since relocating to the underworld with the help of Nico, have built an entire city powered by hydroelectric energy from the river Styx. Will and Nico decide to rest up here and join the troglodytes for dinner, but first Will and Nico must wear some hats. Nico is given a bowler hat and Will is given a cheese wedge hat. Nico explains their quest to the troglodytes, and the trogs say that since coming to the underworld, something feels different. Something is stirring. At this, Nico says he thinks he knows what it is. The mother that Aphales talked about, and the one who is trapping Bob. Nyx, a primordial goddess born before giants, titans, and gods. Nico mentions that they've only met one other primordial goddess, Gaia, and Nyx may be way worse, as she's a goddess of pure darkness. And Nico has met her before. Will asks when, and Nico says it's not something he ever wanted to talk about the first time he went to Tartarus. Will says he doesn't have to talk about it, and Nico says no, it's best that everyone hears the story. Nico had been looking for the doors of death, and after wandering the underworld and finding nothing, Nico figured they must be in Tartarus, a place no mortal had ever been. But Nico figured he could find the doors and close them. Then maybe he could help stop Gaia. So Nico finds the entrance to Tartarus, a hole in the ground, and Nico is debating going down. Then someone sneaks up on him. Nico is just barely able to dodge an attack by Echidna, mother of all monsters. Echidna says Nico is right where Gaia wants him. He can't escape his fate. When Echidna goes to attack again, Nico jumps into Tartarus. Nico falls for a long time before landing on a hard surface and getting the wind knocked out of him. Nico can immediately sense that Tartarus is like nothing he's ever experienced before. It's like the place is alive. Before Nico can explore his surroundings, 3 basilisks raise their head and start heading for Nico, so Nico runs. Soon more monsters join the chase, and Nico runs for his life, slashing behind him and just barely dodging attacks. Then Nico sees a house, and on the porch is a woman who looks to be human. She waves at Nico, and Nico, figuring he has no other choice, heads for the house. And as he gets closer, the monsters start to back off. Nico walks up on the porch and follows the woman inside. The woman is the goddess Nemesis. Nico asks why she helped him, and Nemesis says she has taken a greater interest in demigods ever since Percy Jackson advocated for the minor gods to have more representation. Nemesis says Nico will suffer greatly, but he must endure. Nemesis then gives Nico pomegranate seeds from his stepmother Persephone's garden, as Nico will soon need them. Then there's pounding on the door. It seems the monsters have decided to risk the power of the goddess. Nemesis leads Nico out the back and tells Nico to follow the river of fire. It will lead him to the doors of death. Nemesis offers one more piece of advice to Nico. She tells him to watch out for her mother. Then Nico leaves. As Nico is traveling across Tartarus, he notices bubble-like sacks on the ground. Nico touches one and it pops. From the goo rises an Empusa. Nico quickly slashes it with his sword. The monster turns to ash, but a new bubble appears. Inside is the Empusa. Nico figures monsters must regenerate quicker here in Tartarus, and to avoid the rest of the sacks. The further Nico continues into Tartarus, the more he can feel his mind slipping. Nico tries to focus, but he starts to hallucinate, becoming paranoid. Nico then feels the ground underneath him shift. That's when Nico realizes Tartarus isn't just a place. Tartarus is alive, the god himself. This is almost enough to drive Nico absolutely insane. Nico breaks down and sobs, feeling completely minuscule. What was he thinking coming here? Nico's lungs burn from the acid air and he's desperately thirsty. Nico finally gives in to his thirst and drinks from the Phlegethon, the river of fire. And surprisingly, this helps. The burning stops and Nico feels a little bit better. So Nico continues towards the forest. Days pass, or maybe hours, or even just minutes. Nico has absolutely no sense of time, and he misses his friends, Percy, Jason, Annabeth, but he wonders if they miss him. Finally, Nico comes across a dark stone archway. Nico has no ideas if it's the doors of death, but Nico approaches anyway, and on the other side is darkness, and Nico hears voices. One of the voices belongs to a woman, and she's huge, and her face is shrouded in darkness. The woman then senses Nico and snatches him up in clouds of darkness. She tells Nico he is a fool to enter her house. And the other voice belongs to the god Hypnos. Hypnos says that Nico seems harmless, but the woman tells Hypnos to stop being soft. The woman reveals herself as Nyx and sends Nico's mind into darkness. Nico screams. But then two giants show up, Otis and Ephialtes, and they demand that Nyx hand over the demigod. Gaia requires him. At this point, Nico can just barely manage to stay awake. Nyx refuses at first, but the giants say it's Gaia's wishes and Nyx will be rewarded for her help. As Nyx is distracted, Nico makes a break for it, but he doesn't make it too far as he's surrounded by complete darkness, the embodiment of nightmares. Nico sees things that make him go absolutely insane. He breaks down and sobs, and Nyx is able to catch up to him. Nico asks what this place is, and Nyx says it's the Mansion of Night, an expression of who the goddess is. And now Nico can see everything, every horrible thing. Nico gives up. Nyx hands Nico over to the giants, but tells Nico that if he survives, they will continue their conversation, and Nyx will make him choose his true nature. Nyx hands Nico over to the giants who put him in a jar. Before Nico loses consciousness, all he can think is that he failed everyone. As Nico finishes his story, everyone is quiet. Nico feels raw and vulnerable and reaches into his pocket to hold the coin that Will gave him. Usually this makes him feel better, but this time it doesn't. Will reaches for Nico and Nico cries into his boyfriend's shoulder, and Will does his best to comfort him. Eventually, Nico calms down and says he thinks this is all connected. Nyx is luring Nico to Tartarus because she's not done with him. Nyx believes people can't change. Nico can't escape his demons and be happy, and Bob, a former Titan, can't be good. So Nyx wants to show Nico that. However, now that Nico has Will to remind him of all that is good in his life, maybe this time will be different. When Nico faces her, Nico will show her that people can change. In order to get to her, they'll have to go through her children like Ephialtes, but maybe some, like Nemesis, will help them. The Trogs tell Nico that they can show them a secret passageway to avoid Hades' eyes, but first the Troglodytes insist that Nico and Will get some rest. Nico is too exhausted to resist and quickly falls asleep. Nico dreams he's in a sea of shadows. Then he sees the image of his sister Bianca. Nico yells at the demon to go away. It's Nyx once again messing with Nico's mind. Nyx says that Nico will have to choose. Will he tell Will the truth of who he really is? Then Nyx, in the form of Bianca, shoots an arrow through Nico's heart, and pain explodes throughout his body, and Nico falls into darkness. Nico wakes up in a cold sweat, but relaxes when he sees Will safe and sound, still asleep next to him. But Nico wonders, how was Nyx actually able to hurt him in his dreams? Nico decides it's best not to tell Will and lays back down, but is unable to fall asleep. The story once again jumps to the future as Will and Nico continue their story to Gorgyra. Nico explains that he was annoyed with Leo after Leo had cheated death. Nico was happy his friend was alive, but it went against everything a child of the underworld stood for. Will could tell that Nico was keeping all this inside, so Will brought Nico to the woods and told him to scream and let it all out. Nico refused, so Will did it first, and eventually Nico joined in, the both of them screaming into the night. For the first time, Nico felt understood and cared for. It was then Nico realized he liked Will more as a friend. For Will, it was when Nico helped him out in the infirmary after the battle with Gaia. Gorgyra is moved by their stories. She's so used to hearing stories of isolation that it's refreshing to hear one of connection. Nico asks if he can tell her one more story. Back in the present, Will sleeps in the troglodyte's nest and dreams of Marin, the satyr that first brought him to Camp Half-Blood. Will and his mother were walking through Washington Square Park. Then a pigeon pecks at Will's foot. Then another one, a bit more aggressively. And soon Will is being swarmed, but they aren't pigeons, they're Stomalian birds. Then a satyr, Marin, jumps in front of Will and blocks the birds with an umbrella. But instead of taking Will to Camp Half-Blood like in real life, Marin turns to Will with red eyes and says when the time comes, Nico will leave you, and then Will wakes up. Will notices that Nico is gone and panics for a second that his dream is coming true, but then Nico shows back up with a cup of soup for Will, and Will feels bad for ever doubting Nico. Nico tells Will that they should reach Tartarus today. The troglodytes have found a shortcut. Nico asks if Will is sure he wants to go through with this, and Will says yes. He's scared and worried, but he's not leaving Nico. Nico can tell that Will is having a hard time in the underworld, so Nico brings out the sun lamp that Will packed, and Will almost instantly feels better. It's not the same as the real sun, but it's close. Screechbling and a new troglodyte, His Majesty, then show up and say it's time to leave. So Nico and Will pack up and set off with the troglodytes. Screechbling leads them through a very dark and tiny tunnel. On the journey, Will worries about what's ahead. What will Tartarus be like? Will Will ever see the sunlight or campfires again? Will's mind then starts to slip into darkness, so he starts humming a tune his mom used to sing, and Will feels a little bit better. Nico kisses Will and tells him he's proud of him. He knows how hard this has been for him. They then reach the end of the tunnel, and hand in hand they exit. Nico decides to stop for a bit so Will can rest. He seems very exhausted. The underworld is affecting him more and more. Will drinks some nectar and asks Nico about Hades' palace. Nico tells him, and Will says maybe when this is all over they can go visit. Nico is touched by this. Will not only wants to come back to the underworld, but he also wants to meet his father. All of Nico's frustrations with Will almost fade away. Nico says that sounds like a great idea. The troglodytes then speak up and say they need to make it past one more obstacle and then they will reach the shortcut. Nico asks what the obstacle is, and Screechbling says it's a farm. When they approach the farm, a giant bull humanoid approaches them. Will at first thinks it's the Minotaur, and Nico says no, it's much worse than that. The bull man skids to a stop in front of them and says it's so great that he saw them because they are not going anywhere. We once again jump to the future where Nico and Will continue their story to Gorgyra. Nico is telling her about the first time he asked Will out on a date. Nico was super scared. Nico still has a hard time accepting that it's okay to be gay. Nico then tells a story about when he was in school and he was playing Mytho-Magic with his friend. Nico made a comment about how Ares looked pretty, and his friend said that was super weird and never talked to him again. This was why it was so hard for Nico to open up about who he was. He was afraid of people leaving him, and this is why it was so hard to face Cupid. If Nico admitted it, Jason and everyone would leave him, but that didn't happen, and Nico has learned it's okay to feel the way he does, and everyone at camp still accepts him. So Nico wasn't going to push people away anymore. He was going to ask Will out and try and be happy. So Nico seeks the help of the satyrs. He asked if they could set up a private picnic for him and Will, but the satyrs seemed to misunderstand, and instead of setting up a private picnic, set up a party in the middle of the pavilion in front of the entire camp. Nico was mortified, but he didn't let that stop him. He asked Will out. And Will replied that Nico didn't have to throw him a party. He would have said yes regardless. Will tells Nico that because Nico had the strength to come out in front of the entire camp, that Nico helped so many other half-bloods come out as well, including Piper. Nico had no idea and feels proud of himself that he was able to help others. Gorgyra then speaks up and says it's time she held up her end of the bargain. She promised them a boat. So Nico helps Will stand and they follow Gorgyra. Will stumbles and Nico catches him. Nico asks if Will remembers the first time Will kissed him. Back in the present, Nico introduces the bullman as Menottes. Menottes has been praying for a half-blood, and now he actually gets Nico Di Angelo. How did he get so lucky? Menottes works for Hades and tends to his cattle. Minody says surely Nico has told Will all about him, and Will says no. Nico looks sheepish and Will wonders just how much Nico has kept from him. Nico asks if they can pass and Minody says he needs help with something. Nico says they don't have time. And Minody says it sure would be a travesty if Hades found out what they were up to. Nico says fine, they will help, but only if after they can pass, and Minody promises not to tell Hades. Minody says deal. All he needs is some fruit from Persephone's garden. Nico says no, that's not possible. And Minody says entering Tartarus is also not supposed to be possible. Nico says no one is allowed to take from the garden, and if they get caught, surely Persephone will tell Hades. Nico asks why he wants the fruit, and at this Minody gets all shy. He eventually reveals that he wants it as a gift to his boyfriend, Grayon. At this, Nico is absolutely shocked. Grayon, the same Grayon that tied Nico up and tried to kill Percy? Minody says he's changed, and Nico says he seriously doubts that. But Will says, hey, maybe we should give him a second chance. Nico eventually agrees and says fine, they'll figure out how to get the fruit. Minody then takes them to some demon donkeys which are heading up towards the garden. Screech Bling and His Majesty decide to stay back with Minody, and Nico and Will hitch a ride on some demonic donkeys. The donkeys drop them off right by the gates to Hades' palace. Nico and Will sneak around the gates to the garden, but before they enter, Nico motions to stop. Persephone is here, which will make things much harder. Nico waits for a good moment and then motions for Will to follow. Once inside, Will notices that the garden is breathtaking. It glows like a city in the night. Nico and Will hide behind a bush and see a woman tending to roses, Persephone. Will instantly notices that she is just as gorgeous as the legends say. Will asks how all of this grows without sunlight, and Nico says life finds a way to survive. Will says kind of like how Nico survived in Tartarus. At this, Nico gets embarrassed and changes the subject. He says in order to get the good fruit, they're going to need to head to the center of the garden. So they silently make their way further in. They decide to go with pomegranates, Persephone's sacred fruit. Nico tries to pick one, but his hand goes right through it. However, Will is able to pick one no problem. Will doesn't understand, but Nico says it doesn't matter. Let's just pick more and get out of here. Nico goes ahead to scout and make sure that their path is clear, and as Will is waiting, he hears some rustling in a bush. He hopes it's Nico coming back, but Persephone comes out from behind the bush. Persephone motions for Will to be quiet. Will then looks in the distance and sees that Nico is frozen. Persephone tells Will to look at her, and he does. Persephone asks why Will is stealing from her, and Will gulps out that they need it for a quest. Persephone then tells Will to relax, she's just joking with him. Persephone says she used to treat Nico very poorly, as he reminded her of Hades' unfaithfulness. But recently she's become quite fond of her stepson. There's more to him than he lets on. At this, Will once again feels like he doesn't know his boyfriend. Will asks Persephone how she can love someone from the underworld. Persephone said it's hard for them, creatures of light, to appreciate the darkness, but there can't be light without darkness. And darkness can be beautiful. She then tells Will that there's even darkness in him, and that's okay. So maybe Will should offer Nico his darkness instead of his light. Persephone says he and Nico will be a strong couple as long as they keep trying to understand each other and not change each other. Will offers back the pomegranates, and Persephone says to keep them as a gift, but not tell Nico about their little chat. Persephone then disappears, and Nico comes back and says it's clear to go, so they head back to the farm. When they get back, they notice that His Majesty is herding the cattle, like in perfect unison. She's making them jump, twirl, and dance, and Minody is cracking up. Once they see Nico and Will, they stop, and Minody asks if they succeeded. Will hands over the pomegranates, and Minody is over the moon. He is so happy he gives Nico information as well as safe passage through his lands. He tells them that Nyx has Bob trapped in a regeneration bubble. He also tells them that when they get to Tartarus to follow the river to Damascen's hut, a reformed giant that once helped Percy and Annabeth. Bob's bubble shouldn't be far from there. Nico, Will, and the troglodytes then continue to the entrance to Tartarus. Back in the future, Nico reminds Will of the first time they kissed, hoping that the story will give Will strength to continue on. It was right after Jason's death. Nico had shut down, unable to believe his first friend was gone, and Nico wasn't even there to help him. Outside the Hades cabin, Will impulsively kissed Nico, short and sweet.
And in so much pain and darkness, Will reminded Nico of the light. So Nico does the same for Will just then. They will always be there for each other.
Nico then pulls a coin out of his pocket, a gift from Will. Will then pulls a ring from around his neck on a chain, a gift from Nico. The two together then head towards Gorgyra and the boat that they have provided. Back in the present, the troglodytes lead Nico and Will through more darkness.
Screechblink says they're almost there and to watch your step. The path becomes steep. And that is when Will trips and begins to tumble down. Nico screams for him and his yell attracts the attention of a Draco. Screechblink says he will distract them and for Nico to get Will. Will is knocked unconscious and the troglodytes are struggling against the Draken. Screechblink then appears and says he will watch over Will and for Nico to go help His Majesty. Nico then runs to help the Trog, and with His Majesty's speed, guiding Nico's sword, they are able to slay the monster. They then head back to Will and Screechblink. Thankfully, Will is sitting up and awake. Will is pretty scraped up, so with Nico's help, they wrap up each other's wounds with Will's first aid kit. However, as they continue towards the shortcut, Will isn't healing. In fact, his wounds are getting worse, and a scratch on his abdomen is now a full-blown wound. Will says it's fine, they have to just keep changing the bandages, and he needs to keep eating ambrosia. Screechblink then announces that they've made it. Nico looks out and sees a river with a giant waterfall, the waterfall being the shortcut into Tartarus. Nico thinks this is a joke, there's no way they will survive that. And to make matters worse, it's the Archeon, the river of pain and punishment. If you fall in, not only will your body be tortured, the worst pain you've ever felt, but so will your soul. But only if you deserve to be punished.
And Nico is pretty worried, but Will says, what do you have to be worried about? You haven't done anything that deserves to be punished for. And at this, Nico says, you have no idea what I've had to do. And then Will screams, because you won't tell me. And then they both go silent.
Screechblink then speaks up and says they won't have to go in. Screechblink points to a hut and says she will help you.
The troglodytes say they must now part ways, and Nico thanks them for all they've done. Will tries to apologize to Nico, but Nico says it's okay and let's just go.
They then head to the hut and meet Gorgyra, who watches over the Archeon, who also happens to be her husband. Gorgyra listens to the lonely souls of the river, and those who repent she rescues and keeps in her dress. Nico is also able to hear the souls of the river. Stories from others help Gorgyra forget about the pain she is constantly surrounded by. Nico and Will explain that they need access to Tartarus.
So now past and future finally catch up. As we know, Nico and Will toured Gorgyra's stories about themselves in order to gain access to the boat, but they also learned a lot about each other in the process. So with that, Nico and Will now prepare to sail the said boat over the waterfall and into Tartarus.
As they get ready, Nico tells Will that he always keeps the coin Will gave him, and Will says he always keeps the ring Nico gave him. Gorgyra asks about them, and Nico says after they defeated Nero, they traded keepsakes with each other. Will had the coin made for Nico. On one side is a sun, and on the other side is the helm of Hades, the first gift Will ever gave to Nico. In exchange, Nico gave Will his skull ring. Nico tells Gorgyra thank you. These stories will give them strength in Tartarus. Then Nico and Will sail forward. The closer they get to the drop, the louder the voices get. Nico tells Will to ignore them. They're trying to turn his memories against him.
Will sees the Battle of Manhattan and the battle against Gaia, and more specifically, the moment he let Octavian die. The voices whisper to him that he's a murderer. Nico says no, he's not a murderer, he's a healer.
Octavian's death was not his fault. Will says it was partially his fault because he let Nico kill him, and how does that not bother Nico? Nico says it does, all the time, but Will is not responsible for Nico's actions. Then they near the edge. Nico says to hold on, and then the two fall into darkness. They seem to fall for days, and Will just manages to hear the words, "I love you." The two cling to each other as they fall. They finally see the ground. Nico screams and summons bones from the ground, creating a ramp that their boat slides down and crashes at the bottom. Nico and Will look at each other, and Nico says, "Welcome to Tartarus," and then promptly passes out. Will's not surprised, as summoning so many bones would take a lot of energy, so Will watches over Nico as he sleeps. But he wants to do more. He looks around and notices the regeneration bubbles that Nico talked about. Will decides to scope out the land and see what they're up against. So Will turns the boat upside down over Nico and leaves a Kit Kat for him for when he wakes up, and heads a few feet away towards a hill. But as Will is walking, he accidentally pops one of the bubbles, and inside is a Stamalian bird. Then several others pop, and now there's a whole flock. Will, not being a fighter, tries to run, but the birds catch up to him and start pecking at him. And then Will is carried into the sky. As he looks down, he sees the boat that Nico is under, and there is a creature with horns poking at it. But Will can't do anything as he's carried further away. Meanwhile, Nico wakes up to the creature, who asks him why he's under a boat. Nico, confused, asks, "Who are you?" and then looks around for Will. The creature asks Nico if he's seen a child. Nico asks what child, and the creature says he's supposed to be watching over a child, but he can't find him. Nico once again asks, "Who are you?" and the creature introduces himself as Amphidus. Amphidus asks if Nico will help him. Nico says he's also looking for someone, and if Amphidus has seen his boyfriend. Amphidus says no, but he can sense another demigod nearby. This makes Nico hopeful and asks if Amphidus can help Nico find him. And then maybe after, both of them can help Amphidus find the child he's looking for. Amphidus refuses and gets angry all of a sudden, demanding to know who Nico's father is. He will not help a child of Zeus or Hera. Nico says he's a child of Hades and asks why he doesn't like Zeus or Hera. Amphidus says Hera was the one who turned him into this creature. Nico finds this odd. Why is he in Tartarus in the first place, but pushes the thought aside and convinces Amphidus to help him find Will. Amphidus says Will is close, they just need to cross the river of pain. And then Amphidus walks right into the river. Nico is shocked, and Amphidus says it's fine, it only affects those who need to be punished. Nico takes a deep breath and steps into the river. Nico takes the Kit Kat that he found once waking up. The Kit Kat from Will, hoping it will give him strength to cross the river. The river reminds him of all the people he's killed, the wrongs he's committed, but Nico stays focused and reaches the other side. When Nico approaches Amphidus, the creature asks who Nico is, and has he seen a child? Nico says he's already introduced himself, and they're looking for Will right now. Amphidus says, "Who's Will?" Nico, now concerned, says, "My boyfriend." Amphidus says, "Oh yes," and then races off. So Nico takes off after him. Amphidus stops and says the child was here. Nico says Will isn't here, and Amphidus once again asks who Will is. Amphidus then remembers who he's looking for. The child he's seeking is Dionysus. Nico tells Amphidus that Dionysus isn't a child, he's a grown man. This confuses Amphidus. No, that can't be. Zeus ordered him to protect a child, not a grown-up. Nico then realizes that Amphidus is a dead Mania, a possessed spirit. Amphidus accuses Nico of stealing the child and then lunges at him. Nico dodges and tries to reason with the Mania, but it's no good, so Nico starts to run. But he can't escape, and soon Amphidus tackles Nico. Meanwhile, Will is struggling against the Stamalian birds and manages to get free, but he lands on a regeneration bubble, and it pops. Inside is a man with claws and a dog head, and several other pop after the first. Will realizes what a mistake it was to go off alone. Annabeth and Percy warned him they needed to stick together, and now Will was going to die alone. Will closes his eyes and waits for the attack. But Will doesn't die. When he opens his eyes, he sees a translucent saber-toothed tiger attacking the dog-headed creatures. Small Bob has come to the rescue. Will then hears Nico scream and tells Small Bob that he needs to go save Nico. Small Bob roars in understanding, and Will takes off. He quickly sees Nico and Antiphasis. Will manages to get Nico away, but they can't go anywhere. The dog-headed creatures keep regenerating, and now they're stuck. Nico explains that Amphidus is a Mana looking for Dionysus, and then Will comes up with a plan. He tells Amphidus that the dog-headed creatures have Dionysus. Amphidus then attacks the monsters, leading them away.
However, Nico is upset by this. It's not Amphidus' fault, and now he's going to be stuck here even longer. Will argues that he was only trying to protect them, and Nico says Will wouldn't have had to protect him if he didn't abandon him. At this, Will breaks down and cries, and Nico instantly feels bad and apologizes. Will apologizes and says he did leave Nico a Kit Kat. Nico laughs and says it was delicious, and thank you. Small Bob then comes back over in his cat form and starts purring. Nico picks him up and thanks him. Nico and Will patch each other up, and Nico says Will should rest, so Will falls asleep with his head on Nico's lap. Will wakes shortly after, and the two talk about their first fight and apologize, saying they can't let Tartarus get to them. This place brings out negative emotions. Small Bob then gets their attention and motions for them to follow, so with no other leads, they follow Small Bob. Small Bob leads them back to the boat and meows. Nico figures this means they should ride it down the river. It may lead them to Damascen's hut, and they won't have to walk. So together they push the boat into the Archeon. At first, voices torment them, but soon they fade to background noise. Will decides to rest, and Nico says he'll wake him once something happens. Nico swears he sees shadows in the distance, but they quickly disappear, and soon the landscape starts changing. The air turns misty and acidic, and Nico starts coughing, which soon wakes Will, and soon their skin starts blistering. Nico realizes that if Tartarus is alive, they must be heading into the digestive system. So Will and Nico quickly hop out of the boat with Small Bob before it gets worse. Nico recognizes where they are, the swamp, which means they are close to Damascen's hut. Will mentions it's sort of beautiful, and this shocks Nico. Will then apologizes to Nico for being so close-minded, specifically about the underworld. Nico admits that it hurt when Will called the underworld evil. Will says it's not all bad, and he promises to be more open about it in the future. Nico thanks him and says this means a lot. But all too soon, the dog-headed creatures catch up with them, so Nico tries to summon some skeletons from the ground. But instead of summoning skeletons, he summons giant mammoth goat creatures with bones sticking out of their heads. Nico has no control over them. The monsters destroy the dog-headed creatures in 2 blows. But now they're coming back, and Small Bob changes into a Cybertooth, but Nico doesn't think the odds are in their favor. Either way, Nico charges them and manages to stab one in the leg, and the other one screams, "Carl!" Carl then says to Bartholomew that you're just jealous. Nico and Will are absolutely shocked and confused. Did they just talk? The creatures introduce themselves as Artanae, and they want to die so they can go back to collecting bones underground. So they ask Nico to kill them. Nico now feels uncomfortable doing it. He only attacked because he thought they were trying to kill him, but now it wouldn't be right. Carl continues to bleed out, and Bartholomew says that's not fair. Nico needs to wound him as well. Small Bob, I guess, has had enough of this ridiculousness and rips out Bartholomew's throat, and the two slowly die together, calling each other bro. Will says they should never tell anyone about this, and Nico agrees. They then continue into the swamp. As they walk, Will admits that he's scared of the prophecy and what Nico will have to leave behind. Nico says it will not be you. Will makes Nico promise, and Nico does. Nico swears on the river sticks. Nico and Will are just about to pass out when they finally find Damascen's hut. They rush for the entrance, but it's empty. Seems Damascen still hasn't regenerated. Will and Nico go inside and rest up. Will brings out his lamp and feels instantly better. Nico then lays down and closes his eyes. He instantly falls asleep. Nico dreams of his mother. A memory of when the two were watching floats float by on a river. But this isn't the happy memory that Nico remembers. When his mother turns to him, she has glowing red eyes and tells Nico in a demonic voice that you will never escape here. This is where you belong. And then she pushes Nico into the river and he wakes up. Will is still asleep, so Nico tries to get some more sleep. He does, and he has the nightmare over and over again. Nico wakes up shortly after to Small Bob licking his cheek, and then Will wakes up, and Will notices instantly how cold it's gotten. Nyx must be near. Nico asks Will if he's ready, and Will says absolutely not, no. But since the two don't have much of a choice, they head out of the hut and deeper into the swamp. Soon Nico says they've arrived, but Will doesn't see anything, just dirt. Nico says the veil must still be over his eyes. Nico says there's a path leading to a door, the home of Nyx.
Will still can't see it, and Nico says, "You need to trust me." So Nico leads Will down the invisible path. Once they get closer, Will's vision clears of the veil, and he's able to see the horrible sight. Nico pulls him closer and tells him it's okay, they've got each other. So both head through the door and find Bob trapped in a regeneration bubble. Bob inside is being torn apart and put back together again in pure agony. Nico tries to pop it, but it's not like the others. His sword just bounces off the bubble. Bob speaks to Nico then and says it must be both of them. So Nico and Will combine powers. Will sings, sending power into Nico. Nico's sword glows with the power, and Nico is able to cut Bob free. But there's no happy reunion, as standing behind them is Nyx, who welcomes Nico back. And she's brought a monster army with her, including Nico's old headmaster, Dr. Thorne, and all of Nyx's children, including Nemesis, Hypnos, and Ephalis.
Dr. Thorne wants Nico dead for escaping him, but Nyx says no, not right now, but Dr. Thorne doesn't listen and goes to attack Nico. Nyx then touches him and he folds in on himself, turning into shadows, demonstrating truly just how powerful and horrifying Nyx can be. Nico says Nyx should just leave them, and Nyx says that's not possible and orders her monsters to attack. Bob with his broom comes to the rescue. Nico and Will once again combine their powers and help Bob face the monsters. They're winning, but Nyx doesn't seem to care. She torments Will with darkness, and Nico says to leave him alone. Nyx laughs a cold laugh. Will screams with all his might, and a beam of energy strikes out and actually hits Nyx. She cries out in pain, but the effort causes Will to collapse into unconsciousness.
Nyx yells at Nico to accept his fate, accept his darkness. He belongs here, and Nico will never return to the world above. Nico is surrounded by darkness, trapped in Nyx's hold. Then Nico sees a bright light and he's released. Will is awake, and Nico goes to his side as Bob charges Nyx with his broom. Will is just barely holding on. He can hear the mansion of night and all the horrible things it whispers. Nico says not to fall into despair, but Will is just so drained. Nico tells Will he's strong, he's a son of Apollo, and Nico is keeping his promise. They are both getting out of here. Then Bob comes rushing towards them and says they must leave now while they can. Nico looks back and sees the mansion on fire. It wasn't Bob, but it doesn't matter. Bob takes Will in his arms and the three run away.
When they leave, however, Nico does not recognize the landscape, and then he realizes that the mansion is constantly moving. It's never in one place for long, and now they're standing on the edge of a cliff with nowhere to go, and Nyx has caught up with them, furious that her home has been set on fire. But Bob says it wasn't them. Maybe she should talk to her children, Nemesis and Hypnos. Nyx doesn't care. She will capture them and make them accept who they are. Bob will always be a Titan, and Nico will always be a child of darkness. Bob says she's right. He is a Titan, but what Nyx doesn't realize is people are capable of change. Just because Nyx will never change doesn't mean that others can't, and that thought makes the goddess furious. Nyx tells Nico he can't escape his darkness and to listen to it, and then personifies his demons into actual creatures who surround Nico. Nyx introduces them as Nico's children. Bob says he can destroy them, but Nico stops him. They're cacao demons, personifications of negative emotions, and they were made from Nico's emotions. Will says to just leave them, but Nico can't. Nico can sense which each one was made from. The moment he learned of Bianca's death, Jason's death, the jar, and all the darkest parts of Nico's life. Nyx tells Nico to accept who he is. Then the ground rumbles with Nico's rage, and he says, "You have no idea who I am," and he charges Nyx with his sword. Bob and Will jump in to help in the fight, and Will accidentally gives Nyx hay fever. Nyx then says to the cacao demons to attack Will. They surround him, and Nico screams to stop. And they do. They're not listening to Nyx. They're listening to Nico. Nico tells Nyx that it's over. Nyx refuses and orders Hypnos and Nemesis to attack. So they turn on their mother. Nemesis holds Nyx down as Hypnos makes her drowsy, but they can't put her fully to sleep. Nyx screams that Nico will never escape her and his darkness. And Nico says Nyx misunderstood Nico. Nico is done running away from his demons. He can't escape, she's right, but that doesn't mean they have to define him. He can learn to live with the darkness and the demons.
embrace them.
They are a part of him and are who made him who he is.
Nico names his demons the Cocoa Puffs and relinquishes control of them. They are free to choose their own path.
This is what Nico ends up leaving behind.
Nemesis then screams for them to go. They can't hold Nyx back for much longer. Nico, Will, and Bob try to leave but then remember the cliff, and at the bottom is the Cocos, the river of hopelessness.
But Bob snatches them up and jumps into the river. Bob tries to swim to the riverbank, but he's slowly losing the fight with the river. So Will and Nico tell him how much they love him, and this gives Bob the strength to go just a little bit further. And on the riverbed, Nemesis is waiting for them.
She tells them they need to leave. Nyx is now free. Nemesis then uses her power to change their luck. She tells them they need to ride the Archeon back to the underworld, and then she disappears. And their boat reappears. Behind them, Nico can see Nyx, and she's furious. Thankfully, the boat carries them to safety, leaving the goddess behind.
But soon they see something running after them on the riverbed. The Cocoa Puffs, Nico's demons. Nico says to Bob to stop the boat and lets them aboard.
They were free to choose where to go, and they want to go with Nico to escape Tartarus. So Nico, Will, Bob, Small Bob, and the Cocoa Puffs sail away from Tartarus. Will tells Nico that he's sorry he was always trying to fix Nico, cure his darkness, but now he sees his darkness wasn't something to fix. It should be embraced. It's a part of who Nico is, and Will loves all parts of Nico. Nico thanks Will, but tells him it's okay when Will tries to take care of him. He hasn't had that since Bianca. So maybe in the future they need to find a balance. Nico then drifts off in Will's arms. Nico dreams of his sister Bianca. Bianca tells Nico that an exception was made. Hades has allowed Bianca and their mother to speak to him.
Turns out it was actually Hades who sent the prophecy, and he could not be more proud of his son. And now he just wants Nico to be happy with Will.
Nico asks for a favor. Could Hades free Antithesis from Tartarus? And Hades laughs. Nico could have asked for anything, but he's thinking of others. Hades says it will be done. Nico hugs his mother and sister and they fade away. When Nico wakes up, they're back in the world of the living, and Bob is gazing at the sun and the stars. And he looks back at Nico and Will and says, what a beautiful sight. Soon Long Island and Camp Half-Blood appear. Nico sees Chiron, and when they hit shore, he jumps out and hugs him. Chiron is shocked, but hugs back.
Nico introduces his Cocoa Puffs and Bob and Small Bob, and Chiron says maybe they should talk about their quest over breakfast. So hand in hand, Will and Nico follow him.
Nico and Will explain everything, and then Mr. D says perhaps they should go rest. Nico agrees. Nico and Will split up to go to different cabins, but Nico says he will see Will soon.
Nico looks at all the newly built cabins and thinks about just how much has changed since he first came to Camp Half-Blood.
Nico heads into the Hades cabin, but before going to bed, he iris messages someone, Piper McLean. Piper comes into view with a girl who she introduces as Shell. Shell kisses Piper and says she'll leave her and Nico alone.
Nico apologizes to Piper for not calling after Jason's death. Her and Nico then grieve together, talking about all the good memories they've had with Jason.
Nico says he'd like to be better friends, and Piper says she'd like that as well. Piper brings up how she's struggling to figure out who she is. Nico says we don't need to put labels on things. We're allowed to change. We need to just be us. This helps Piper. They say goodbye, and then Nico gets some sleep.
Nico wakes up in a panic, remembering that he said to Will that he would see him shortly, so he rushes to Cabin 7. When he bursts in, Will is talking to Austin and Kayla in an iris message. They laugh and greet Nico with a wave. Nico asks if he can have some alone time with Will, and they agree, and the call disconnects.
Nico tells Will about Piper, and once again talk about how Nico is more than just darkness, but can also accept his demons.
And surprisingly, Will has really warmed up to Nico's Cocoa Puffs. Will and Nico agree that they're going to be just fine. The two then drift off to sleep. And that wraps up the newest edition in the Riordanverse, The Sun and the Star, a Nico Di Angelo adventure. What was your favorite part from the story? Let me know down below. But until next time, I'm signing off, Half-Bloods, and please, as always, stay safe.